Okay, so I think there's time for some discussion now. For that, that's where I learn the most. What's on people's minds. If some people have to leave, I understand perfectly, so happy to give you time. Don't feel trapped here or anything. Next year, next year. But what's on folks' minds? Yes, sir.
I heard you use the word struggle in our time. We have so much struggle. And when we have that concept of struggle instead of adventure, instead of being able to have a quest, it puts a sort of a damper on things, makes us sort of depleted of energy. Whereas if we have that quest, like you mentioned about a vision quest, or having to be able to have an adventure in life, which life always is, then we're negating people's energy. And I'd love to be able to have us as a whole look at what we can do in a positive way so we keep on having that adventure done.
I like that, and I love the word adventure. So I appreciate your comment there. The word adventure is more inspiring than struggle. But of course, adventure includes struggle. I mean, we don't want to sugarcoat things. They're real forces that we're up against, real forces. And the bigger picture is adventure, I agree. But the daily picture is often struggle. And
Use that word effort.
I wouldn't say it's either or. What's that?
If you use the word effort instead of struggle,
Effort.
you're putting effort into it,
Uh-huh.
and struggle still has that impediment, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
effort, you have to put effort in.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank you. Yes?
I was wondering, how is this word being spread about the new order? Obviously, you're speaking to us. What could I do to, for example, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. That's my hometown. How could I would love for people there to know about this.
Great.
How is the
Yeah.
word being spread since it's self-organized?
Yeah, right. Well, there's a web page
Okay.
called theorderofthesacredearth.org. And as I say, there's like private distribution of this book. They have some here, but it's not officially being released until June, which is fine, because it allows us to kind of get moving in a slow, modest way. But obviously spread the word, with your folks back home. That's great. Again, we can't do the media at this time,
Got it.
but something like social media or that you can do. And again, I think there's a hidden blessing to this, that it's not about news or entertainment. It's something deeper than that. So again, I would invite your own imagination in this regard. You could write Jen and Skylar. Their addresses would be on the webpage there, and start a blog about it too. So just word of mouth is how we're starting, and I don't think that's a bad way to start. But using the social media tool, but we don't want to do it in what can I say, in a big commercial kind of way.
I hear that.
Yeah.
I'm excited about the solstice event, and I'm hoping if there were a community in Louisville, for example, where I will be on the
Absolutely.
solstice,
Marvelous.
that we could tune in.
Yes.
So
Well, I
that-
have some contacts in Louisville for sure.
I'm sure you do, Mr.
Why don't you talk to me about that afterwards?
Okay.
There's a fellow there who's put on a number of events around spirituality, and he's a good organizer, and I would think he'd be a good ally there. Yeah, great. Yes? You please.
Yes. Well, you spoke about all religions and how people are turning away from them. Well, all religions have said, "Thou shalt not kill," and that means kill. Like you can't kill a cow without killing him. I mean, he's not born to be killed, and yet no one has ever obeyed any of those of the religions. I don't know any, well, there's a few religions that do it there. But when we're all killing and murdering, how can we expect peace? How can we, if we're not peaceful, how, you know, even if you're not the person doing it, you are paying that person to do it. Do you see what I mean? There is that's a very large part of our society and how we're harming the earth. And there's a man named Salash Rao, R-A-O, and I think you should write it down. He's an engineer, and he's written 2 books, Dharma Yoga and Harbor Yoga. And they're exactly along the lines of what you're talking about in what you do.
Thank you. Yes?
A year ago, in the living room of our home, a nun by the name, a Dominican nun by the name of Sister Colleen came to our home with similar idea of what you're talking about. And she spent 2 hours talking about the need for us to commit ourselves to planet Earth. With my age, I have a little memory loss, but I will get her name. I will put you in touch with her because she is obviously in harmony with everything you're talking about. And that would be a good ally.
Yeah, thank you. Is she from California or where does she reside?
Well, she was pretty high in the Dominican order, and she's now in part of their government, and she's committed to seeing that all of their hospitals are doing everything they can to be sensitive and in tune with planet Earth, saving planet Earth, and so putting all of their hospitals into programs that will be effective in that regard.
Great. Please send me the connection. Glad to hear it. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
I'm a physician, and I wonder if you might brainstorm with me about how you see this evolving in different areas, such as medicine.
Yes. Well, in my book, The Reinvention of Work, which I wrote several years ago, I made this point. By the way, I made this point when I was with these scientists this summer, and there was quite a lot of response. I made the point at this point. Luther talked about the priesthood of all believers, but I talk about the priesthood of all workers. If you're doing good work in the world, whether in the area of medicine or counseling or teaching or carpentry or art or politics or whatever, that you are a midwife of grace. And that's the archetypal definition that I run with, what a priest means. It means a midwife of grace. So I think the first thing we have to do in our professions is to desecularize them in the sense of to lift up the nobility that's there, potentially, if not in reality. Because that's how you move reality, right? What's possible. Like when I mentioned this to the scientists, and of course it's easy to do for me anyway, talking to scientists, they bring awe into our lives. Aquinas said, a mistake about creation results in a mistake about God. So I quoted this to the scientists, said, so you guys are busy telling us about creation. That means you're busy giving us insight about divinity. And after I talked about that, and I left the room, well, we all left the room for dinner, someone came up to me the next day and said, you know, there's this great big guy, a scientist. After he talked yesterday, he stayed in a seat and sobbed for 20 minutes. He said, I just hung around to watch him sob. He said, I've never seen a 250-pound scientist sob for 25 minutes. So it really hit me. Our professions have been so secularized. This is why we're at each other's throat all the time in academia and the hospital and everything else, that we've taken it out of the context of the sacred. And to really realize what you're trying to do, you know, what is the essence of the calling to be a doctor, a healer, a nurse? First of all, there's a lot of work involved. You know, you got to do your study and all that stuff.
But behind it all, there is this desire to heal, to be a healer, to be a midwife of grace, the grace of physical healing, or the grace of psychological healing when people break down and all the rest. So I think we have to reconstruct all of our professions around grace, concept of grace. Like I say, otherwise we're dealing with an original sin concept. And like education, there are two ways to look at education. One is, as Yates says, education is not about filling a pail and giving exams ad infinitum. It's about lighting a fire. Because the desire to learn is inside all of us. Our minds are made for truth just as much as our stomachs are made for good food. And just as you salivate over a good meal that's put in front of you, well, we should be salivating. Students should be salivating over truth. And by truth, I mean whatever, whether you're studying art or history or science or medicine. It's a thrill. It's one of the cheapest thrills in the world, except when education gets his hands on it and makes it exorbitantly expensive. But learning is one of the most ecstatic and cheapest ecstasies you can have in life. And we've turned it into this horrendous suffering for our sins, I guess. It's a secular version of original sin ideology that's driving the joy out of education and the joy out of learning. One student, I am teaching a course next week on reinventional work at the new school, the Fox Institute of Creative Spirituality. And I've invited Bernard Amadei to come in because he teaches at the University of Colorado. He's an engineer. He came into our program a number of years ago. And I remember when he landed, so to speak, he said, I've been teaching engineering for 27 years. I'm burned out by engineering and I'm burned out by academia. I don't know what's next. A few weeks into our program, he came to me and said, I got my soul back. Now, first of all, notice what he just said. He had lost his soul teaching in our academia engineering. He said, I got my soul back. He went back to Boulder and he started Engineers Without Borders, which now has over 18,000 members all over the world in 42 countries, doing all the marvels or miracles that engineers can do, teaching people to create solar-generated irrigation systems and all the wonderful things that engineers can do. So it's no different with doctors. But you have to look at the training and how the training, I mean, I have a friend who was a Catholic priest, still is. He was invited to join a major medical school in America, but if I told you the name, you'd know what I mean. I mean major. We're way up there. I don't want to tell the name. Why was he asked to come there and live on campus? Because 9 first-year students of medicine had committed suicide the year before. So instead of standing back and saying, what are we doing wrong here? Taking young, idealistic adults who want to be healers, and within 6 months they want to kill themselves. Maybe we're doing something a little bit wrong. No, they have hired this chaplain to go around putting his fingers in the dike. Please don't commit suicide today. Please don't commit suicide. I went to visit him. I haven't been there in years. He is in the dorm. And we sat down to talk for about half an hour. Door knocks. He says, I'm sorry I have to leave. This young girl wants to commit suicide. So there I was. I was sleeping 3 years and all that. I mean, it's just crazy when I'm asking the questions. In one of the most privileged high schools in the country is in Palo Alto. Palo Alto High School. That's where Stanford University resides. So they've got PhD teachers in high school, they got swimming pools, they got a full theater department, they got it all. 8 students have committed suicide in the last few years, jumping in front of the commuter train to commit suicide. What has the school done about it? They hire volunteer parents to walk the railroad tracks. Yeah, just like this school did, this medical school did. Please don't commit suicide today. They haven't backed up and said, what the hell are we doing wrong when 15-year-olds want to kill themselves? So I did my own study, and this is what I learned. The number one question in that school is this: what Ivy League school are you getting into? It's a value question. It comes from their parents, not from the kids. And that's why the kids are anxious, stressed, and jumping in front of railroad trains. When I taught inner city kids, 64% of black boys in America are not graduating from high school today. So I chose to move to the inner city to teach, not to move there, but to take my pedagogy there, that I was pleased with what I did with these adults, like this engineer guy. I took it to the inner city kids. Not one of them committed suicide or was threatening to commit. They leave school before they commit suicide. It's the privileged ones that I think of committing suicide. They take education so seriously because of their parents. Now, of course, when inner city kids drop out of school, that can be pretty close to suicide, because when education fails, incarceration usually happens next. But I'll see actually a lot of incarceration is a school for these kids. But the point is that, everywhere we're stuck in a modern consciousness that is very patriarchal, where joy is not even talked about, much less practiced. The joy of education, the joy of learning. That's what these kids learn. When I was working with these inner city kids for 2 years, by the way, at the end of our pilot project, 100% said they wanted to stay in school. Why? Because they experienced the joy of learning. How did they do that? Because what we were doing was around creativity. We had them making movies. We had them making murals. We had them creating rap and poetry and so on. There's where the joy is found. The Hindu scriptures say that. In joy, in creating, there is joy. And in joy, there is creating. So, I think that's what you talk about medicine. We have to back up and look at the. Now, I will say this about medicine. There are more medical schools in this country today offering meditation classes than there are seminaries. That's a fact. There are more doctors learning to meditate, thanks to some prophetic figures in the medical field, learning the importance of calming the reptilian brain. They're more doing that than in seminaries. And this is why I would say so many seminaries are shutting down. Because they have sold their soul to the accreditors who are only about the left brain. They're only about the analytical, rational thing. It was Einstein who said, do not trust the intellect too much. The intellect does not give you values. Intuition gives you values, he said, or deep feeling, which are the same thing. He said, values do not come from the intellect. The intellect gives you methods. It does not give you values. And so if our entire educational system is being rewarded, accredited by boards that are only about the rational, the intellectual, and that which is quantitative, like how much money do you have in the bank, and how many janitors can you hire, and how many books in your library, and don't even know how to ask the questions about intuition, what I would call mysticism. That's what's killing education. And you see, your question is so important. It's across the board. Whether you talk about engineering or medicine or preachers or anything else. I have met over the years lots and lots of graduates of music conservatories and art schools. And all of them have told me the same story. That they went into music, they went into art because they loved it. But by the time they finished school, they often had something close to a nervous breakdown. There was no connection to the soul in most of their training. It was all about technique. You see, technique is so easy to grade. It's so easy to grade. But the soul dimension was missing. So, it's really interesting that we can't really talk about these things without talking about education. Education is the funnel through which we pass so many workers in our culture. And we have to step back and say, is the funnel modern while we're living in a postmodern time? And that's, I think, what has to be changed. And as Einstein says, then the values will flow again. And life will flow again, and joy will flow again. But until then, we get into this narrower and narrower version of a profession. And, and a lot of damage goes on. Thomas Berry says most of the collapse of the ecosystem in the world today is happening at the hands of people with PhDs. You see, so knowledge alone is not enough. It's a weapon. It's very dangerous. We must balance that with wisdom. And our schools are not set up for that, unfortunately. Yes?
Thank you so much for everything that you brought to our consciousness today. I'd really like to hear how do we address what's going on in these liberal arts schools today, which is these fractionalized identity safe spaces. The protection, the bubbles that are happening within the universities, is kind of the opposite of what I grew up with, and the censure of a lot of literature and the conversations which have. I'll just give you one example. There's an article in the New York Times magazine, New Yorker magazine, about what was happening at it was actually about Oberlin, one of the most liberal university schools in the country, the first to admit women, the first to admit blacks, and the director was just almost vilified and taken down. And one of the examples, I guess, I want to try and bring this down, was this guy was suicidal, and so he thought that Antigone should be taken out of the literature because Antigone commits suicide at the end of the play. And this is what's happening. They want the students are so oversensitized to their own feelings that they are shutting out anything that gives them any kind of disturbance. How do we reach these young people, and how do we impact what's going on in that way? And I use too many words, but I don't even know how to address the issue, but it really disturbs me deeply.
Well, I'm reminded of Pope Francis's late when he talks about narcissism of our culture, of our time. I think that and then there is the political correctness that is sometimes overdone, and so we need new venues of discourse. But as you see, a lot of our young people are growing up in hothouse situations where they're not taught how to deal with the darkness of life. You see, we've been running on this mythology of consumerism, which is, you can buy your way out of everything. And, that we're not dealing with the tragedy and the struggle in life, such as great literature and much else would instruct us in. I think that the plastic world of consumerism, it creates one-dimensional people. And again, this is where we need to, I think, we need to take instruction from these great mystics who take us in, like we talk about the dark night of the soul, to have young people know that there is such a thing. Of course, many of them have been in it. There's a lot of struggle in all people's lives. And of course, the whole thing about going into nature and learning from nature the vicissitudes of reality. And Deepak Chopra, he wrote a foreword to the new version of my book on evil called Sins of the Spirit, Blessings of the Flesh, Transforming Evil in the Soul and Society. And then he says two things. He says, in his foreword, he says, this is the most number one spiritual issue of the 21st century is evil. And then he says, millions of people are leaving organized religion, but we don't see any sign that there's less evil in the world. So I think part of it is the failure of religion. I think that religion has so oversold sin that people don't even want to talk about evil. But you see, they're not the same thing. And we do have to talk about evil.
Jung said, in the age of Aquarius, which we're now in, evil will no longer be under the table. It'll be above the table. It'll be conscious. But we all will have to choose. And I think that we're swimming in a lot of evident evil at this time in history. And certainly lying is an example. A community cannot survive if its leaders are committed to lying. There's always some lies, but to have it as a regular thing is truly dangerous, because truth then gets devalued. So too is denial. Denial is a form of lying, and there's a lot of that's been bought in our culture, and that is the puppet strings of politicians. So there's a lot we can criticize in our culture today, and young people too. But again, I think to be able to create communities, in the loose sense of the word, circles of young and older people together, trying to sort out truth and sharing their stories. And if you've been so moved by Antigone, then you're just the person to share it with some young kid who is also facing questions of suicide and so forth. So, I mean, there is a lot to be learned, absolutely, from the wisdom of the past. And this is what great art teaches us. Yes?
I have been teaching in the community college system for about 100 years.
Just feels like it.
Yeah, and
Is that community college system, did you say?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
The colleges in Orange County.
Okay.
And things get worse every year. 15 years ago, our standards went down so much that the onus is always on the teachers. We are not doing it right. Yeah. The students aren't ready to write basic essays, and we're supposed to teach them college writing, and they can't write sentences, and so on. And then they throw things on us like the SLOs. I don't know if you know what that is. We had to redesign everything to make sure we are covering student learning outcomes by at least 3 aspects of what they should know by the end of the class, and so on. And it just goes on, increasing our work to such a degree that there is no innovation left. And those of us who are, quote unquote, creative and recycling are really kind of lagged for speaking up. So I won't go into that part. But the new thing that they're bringing into our sphere is what they call guided pathways, which means that a student needs to know at 15 what he or she wants to do for the rest of his life, so that when they come to college, they have to follow a guided pathway. And if they change their direction, they begin again. And this is, further mechanization of the whole thing.
Yeah, I hear you. First, I want to say thank you to you for your 100 years of service. It seems like 100 years. You don't look quite that old yet. But really, you're on the front lines, and that's such important work. And it's important that everyone here has this kind of testimony from a teacher, that you're such a gun. A few years ago, when I published my book on education called The Awe Project, Reinventing Education, Reinventing the Human, we're talking about to bring the wisdom out of the kids. We're not allowed to. We have to do all this other stuff, and especially the exam prep. So, I don't think people really realize what the crisis that's at hand here. But as far as a structured pedagogy goes, that's what I've been working on for 35, 40 years. So that in my programs, we now we've got master's and doctoral programs and programs for adults. We have the morning are seminars, so that's what I would call the intellectual work, reading and writing papers and discussion and debates and all that. But the afternoon we have what we call art as meditation. So we're training this intuitive brain that Einstein talks about, and where the values really come from. And that's where real breakthroughs happen in people's lives. That they can make connections, doing play as meditation, or dance as meditation, or chanting, or painting, and so forth. And especially for adults, it's so important to get out of their heads and to get more into the intuitive brain and the heart. And so that's what we find, the balance of the two really, really works. At the end of the day, there's tremendous energy. And that's what you want. You want the teacher to be energetic and the student to be energetic at the end of the day, not everyone tired and worn down. And so this has been imitated in different places. A number of years ago, a woman came up to me in Ohio. She said, a judge came to me 2 years ago and said, I'm sick and tired of sending inner city kids who get in trouble to jail, high school kids. He said, well, you create a school I could send them to instead. So she said, I was reading your book, and so I created a school that's all about creativity, nothing else. From 9 to 3, they do dance, they do theater, they do singing, they do poetry and rap. And this is what happened. Number one, they came. Every day they came. Well, that's a clever idea, isn't it? Create education that the kids care about. Number two, they stayed over. They insisted that the teachers stay an extra hour every day. And then she said about 3 months into the program, they'd come to me and say, who's this dude Shakespeare? And what's this thing called algebra? And what am I missing if I'm not doing geometry? So what that proved to me is we're doing education backwards. You begin with the kids' heart. And that has to do with their expressing themselves, especially in adolescence. And then the motivation, the fire is lit. Then the motivation to go deeper. How did Shakespeare do this? How did Mahler do it? How did whoever do it, this writer do it? Then the questions come. You don't begin by stuffing the answers into the kids. You begin by eliciting. Education means educere, to lead out. You lead out their own wisdom. And these kids today, they're not dumb and they're not naive and they're not even innocent. There's a lot going on inside of them, and they need to be invited. I'll tell you, when I was doing this program with inner city teenagers, one day an 18-year-old senior, African-American guy, he turned to me and said, this is the first time in 4 years of high school that anyone's asked me to express myself creatively. So even learning to write, as you say, a pretty basic task. You've got to motivate the kid to want to express themselves in a way that's shareable, in a language with the rules that make it shareable. And so you begin with the delight, you begin with the joy of sharing your ideas. You don't begin with a whole list of grammatical rules. You know, I don't think that works for a lot of kids.
No, I do as many grammar as possible. We do more writing and play.
Yeah.
And I have them write journals, which are also self-evaluations of what they learned and what came up with them.
But really what I'm talking about is the students you have who missed out in high school. Because you're getting kids at college age who can't write.
That's right.
So that goes back a few years. They're landing on your lap. It's become your problem. But the real issue is backing up and saying, when was this? And of course, we need better parenting. We need parents who are reading to their kids when they're very young. All this has now been proven that when kids hear the spoken word spoken to them when they're young, they get, just like they get language, they get grammar too. But if the parents are not committed to sharing their learning skills with the kids, then the kids fall behind. You know, so it's
Change everything from the
yeah,
ground.
yeah. Well, I think it's all changing because it's all dying.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing like death to get people moving again.
I just wanted to bring up something that has interested me lately, which is Finnish educational system. I don't know if you want to comment on it. They took away exams and they took away homework, and they're completely devoted to developing joy in life and the socialization with the students, that they have free time to explore. And they went from being the worst on the globe in all the outcomes to being the best in the globe in outcomes, because the kids are really motivated to doing this. They only go to school a few hours a week, but it's in one of the Michael Moore
Where to
movies.
invade next?
What is it?
Where to invade next?
Yeah, and where to invade next. And when it's mind-blowing to an American anyway, when you see the teacher saying, yes, our goal in education is actually to have them enjoy life. And then Michael Moore's looking, what? No exams, no homework, no.
I was actually invited after my reinvention workbook came out a number of years ago to meet with Finnish in Finland with the heads of many of the departments. One was education, and there are others too. And I was trying to kind of lay my philosophy on them. It sounds kind of deja vu to me there.
Yeah.
They took it and run with it. But, and then of course in our own society, we've got Maria Montessori, we've got Waldorf schools. You know, there are some efforts to do education differently that have been quite successful. And we should acknowledge that too. In fact, there are some places in California, I think, where public schools are becoming Waldorf schools or vice versa. And I think that has some real promise to it. Because one problem with the Waldorf schools is they are short of money, whereas the problem with the public schools is they're stuck in old practices. But anyway, anything else besides education people want to talk about here? Yes?
This is more in support of something you said earlier, and it's about, I had this vision, if you will, or dream about bridging the gap between the younger generation and the elders. And so I got involved out in the desert in some of the Native American cultures and rituals and so on. And met a group of young people who said exactly the same thing, that we would like to spend more time with older people and learn from them. And so it really just resonates with everything that you said. And so I've been thinking of a way, I'm calling it bridging the gap. And I'm beginning to do a mini vision quest and things like that, and inviting. I've only done it with one group or the other, but I'm considering now, after listening to you too, maybe bringing both together as I do one of those programs. But I think it is so important for the continuation and growth for all of us and for the earth to bridge that gap. I think we both have something to offer each other.
Well, I'm so glad that you're working in that field, and I certainly encourage you. And you're so right. You know, the old become young again by hanging out with the young, and the young have plenty to learn from the old. So it's organic. It's natural. I mean, think about this: how grandparents have a unique relationship with grandchildren. It's organic. The oldest and the youngest. Because in some ways they're both kind of beyond the boundaries of that which keeps the culture going, which is the parental age, if you will. And so they can both kind of think out of the box. There's more freedom. And I also think, a lot of the diseases that older people are encountering in our culture, including Alzheimer's and all that, I think a certain amount of that, certainly not all of it, but I think a certain amount of it is the lack of interaction with youth and with play. And, that there are so many ways to learn besides reading a book or passing an exam. And remember, the indigenous people, their educational systems lasted, 200,000 years or so before we came along with desks and books and Ritalin for the boys who didn't like sitting at a desk for 7 hours a day. We told them they have a disease. But how did the old people do it, for over hundreds of thousands of years? They did it through ritual. And in ritual, the young and old get together. I remember when I was working with Aboriginals in Australia, a lady said to me one day, she said, quite quietly, she said, well, in our culture, everybody works 4 hours a day, and the rest of the day, we make things. And I said, and what are you making? Well, rituals. And we're teaching the children how to do the chants and what it all means, connecting to the stars and to the cosmos. And the costumes for our bodies, so our bodies would be as beautiful as the snakes and the birds. And she went on and on and on. There's all this work to do if ritual matters to you. Of course, we live in a culture where ritual is about another shopping day. But the truth is, I like to look at Stonehenge. What got our ancestors 5,000 years ago to get out of their couches and turn off their TV sets and drag 1,000-ton rocks before the wheel was invented for
for miles and miles. What did that to them? It was ritual. It was connecting the human psyche to the solstice and the equinox. It was the psyche yearning to connect to the whole, to the cosmos. That yearning is in all of us, but it's been aborted by modern consciousness that cut us off from our relationship to the whole. But it's coming back with the new cosmology. And so we have to understand that there's so many ways to teach and to learn. And ritual is the most fun, the most physical, and the most obvious way of connecting science and psyche, cosmos and psyche. And creativity, that's what ritual's about. That's when the dancing happens. That's when the musicians come alive. That's when the chanting happens. That's when you go into altered states. I'll tell you a funny story. I had a good friend who was a Seneca woman. She was on the faculty for years. She was also a Franciscan sister, Sister Jose Habde. Some of you may have heard of her. She told me years ago, she's deceased now, but very early when I met her, she said in our culture, we learn to dance before we learn to walk. And my Aristotelian logic did not grasp that, but I shut up. I learned to shut up around people, live for myself, and to learn something. So for years and years, I was turning to her mind, how could you possibly dance before you walk? And one day I was at a powwow. It was in Minnesota. It's about 800 Indians. And you're in concentric circles dancing. The oldest are in the middle, and then the next oldest men. Of course, the teenagers are on the outside, so they have to dance about 20 times harder than anyone else, which is really smart. It took about 10,000 years to figure that trick out. But so it's like midnight. The drums are going, there's a bonfire, and the stars are out. And all of a sudden, this young man, young Indian guy, long black hair, came dancing wildly by me with a newborn baby in his hands. And then it just hit me. Her words. We learn to dance before we learn to walk. Makes all the sense in the world. So, ritual wisdom and ancient wisdom could just flip everything. And maybe we should begin there with redefining education. That because the primary goal of education, I think, is to connect the human heart and psyche to the universe. That's what wisdom is. Wisdom is about a relationship to the habits of the universe. And maybe if it began that way, everything else would fall into a more proper perspective. And I think Maria Montessori had a lot of insight about that. She talks a lot about how every child wants to know the universe and their place in the universe. And that's where you begin education. Because that's adventure. That's what's exciting. This adventure we're on. The universe is not a noun, it's an adventure. It's still growing, for God's sake. It's still creating new planets and new everything. And here we are. We're riding along. How could we possibly leave that out of our instruction? That's why I call my education book the Awe Project, Ancestral Wisdom Education. Awe begins with awe. What's the awe of being a doctor? What's the awe of being an engineer? What's the awe of being a lawyer? What's the awe of being an architect? That's what our architects and engineers have to tell us. What's the marvelous thing about being this? And don't tell me it's about your paycheck. No, tell me about something that has to do with the heart. It comes down to service. It's meant to be service. It gets cluttered and sidetracked and all this, of course. Everything human has to renew itself. But I think that's part of the joy of learning is preparing to serve. Yes?
I love everything you're saying, and I've been very involved in so many aspects, and I really found some words in the Vedas that just changed my life. It talks about joy and being present to the breath as being the ecstasy of the universe and the goddess. But at the same time, I also recognize, I've had my other leg in the field of, deep politics and dark forces on this planet, and now that it's becoming so clear that it is so truly rigged right now that, so our 20 people have the wealth of the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet. It's so, the wealth so intensified in the hands of just a few, and anyone that goes up against that seems to mysteriously disappear. And the way they took out Occupy sort of weekends all over the country, it just seems that things are so rigged that I'm almost giving up on the working in the field and just putting my energy into internal work, interior work, and waiting for some benevolent aliens to come in and help us. But it just seems like it's not even the red or blue; it's just the corporations that are really running the planet and seem to have an agenda to reduce the population with all the dumbing down and the antidepressants. Everyone is just sort of half asleep, or they're out of a job, or they're homeless. And I just wonder how you address all that. But I would just like to see you and Deepak and the Dalai Lama walk over to name one of those corporations, and I think of the ritual at the Bohemian Grove where they do their rituals, sort of satanic rituals that are sort of undermining our life on this planet.
Well, first of all, I think you've named a lot of reality there, and you're living it, so I appreciate your testimony there. And that's what I meant earlier. I think that evil is coming out above board. Even this breakthrough, really, with Weinstein and his abusing, and now all these other abuses being named, and all the rest. Jesus said, truth will make you free. So in the midst of this evil, and then to realize, of course, it's not just that 20 people have a lot of money. It's that 20 people, because of the money, make decisions about our political parties and therefore our judges and our Supreme Court. And of course, Citizens United just boosted all that, etc., reducing our votes to who has the most money, including corporations and all the rest. So there's so much going on. So you do have to find some kind of still place. You do have to somehow meditate, whatever, and empty oneself and all that. Because we have to stay grounded in a time like this. Well, one of the images I have is a sailboat, You've got to have a keel. Because there's a lot of winds. Every news cycle, every day there's new winds that are blowing. And we could easily blow over, we could easily get lost, we could easily sink, or as you say, just drop out. But that's where I think the whole energy of the warrior is so important. And we have to use our brains in all this too, strategy. And that's where I talked about, as examples, the 350 movement, to go after, and this does have an effect. When you go after banks, for example, who are bankrolling the pipeline and so forth, and doing what the indigenous people were doing to block the pipeline and all the other people who showed up to do it with them and so forth. And that battle is not over yet at all. And this is where hope comes in, that you have to realize, first of all, that imagination and creativity are our weapons. They always have been the weapons of prophets and of the oppressed and of those out of power, as this power is defined by the ruling class. So this is where imagination is so important. This is why something as simple as art as meditation in our classrooms is so important. We have to keep our imaginations lubricated. There's a beautiful book by Walter Brueggemann. It's not a long book, but he's a great biblical scholar, called Prophetic Imagination. And he says that the artist has always been a threat to the powers that be. And that, so this is part of taking a vow to defend Mother Earth. That you're taking a vow to develop your imagination. What did Gandhi do? What did King do? What did Mandela do? They gathered the anger. Anger is a very potentially positive force. They gathered the anger of their people and turned it into something useful. So it didn't just splatter on the wall or get turned into alcoholism or self-pity or something else. But they gathered the people. And they create strategies of filling the jails and getting noticed and so forth. So I think all this is part of the project. And of course, where you are at this time in your journey is your judgment to make. You know, you may need a retreat. You may need to step aside for a while to take care of yourself. But ultimately, the ideal, I think, is that we can learn to be both contemplative and active at the same time. That we can take the time, structure time, even on a daily basis, for one's own filling up and emptying, as well as carrying imagination into our work in the work world, the citizenship, taking on powers that be in more and more imaginative ways. I'll tell you a story. Years ago, I did a conference at the Spirit Earth Conference. It was in Portland. And my workshop was on the Cosmic Christ. And among other things, I had people doing circle dances. And after the conference, after the workshop, a young man came up to me. He was in his 20s. He said, I am a zealot for the forests up here in Oregon. He said, I've been to jail more times than I can count. I lie myself down in front of bulldozers, I climb trees, I get arrested all the time. But he said, those dances you did with us are the most radical thing I've ever done. And he said, I can hardly wait to take them back to my fellow zealots in the woods. And I want to point out, I've never met anyone in my life who admitted he was a zealot. But this guy had some self-knowledge at 23 years of age. So 2 years later, I ran into him. I said, what happened? Did you take the dances back? Oh, he said, I took the dances back to my fellow zealots, and it changed totally the way we approach our protest. For one thing, it broadened our sense of colleagues and allies in the struggle, because before we were so self-righteous. We knew that we were right, and for example, hunters were all wrong. But because of the dances, we broadened, and now we include the hunters in our struggle because they are aware, hunters are aware that the game are disappearing in the woods. So they are our allies. So he went on and he talked about this change of consciousness that came through circle dancing. Broadened his meaning of politics and broadened his capacity to get something creative done. So there's a lesson in there. And notice, a circle dance is something bodily. We're not going to solve things with our heads alone. We've got to bring our bodies to the task. And that's part of the joy. It's part of the sharing. That's part of what we have in common. You know, there's no such thing as a Roman Catholic body and a Lutheran body, an atheist body, or a Buddhist body. We've all got bodies. And there's not a black body and a red body and a tan body and a Caucasian body. We all got bodies. Why don't we begin there with what we have in common? And doctors know this. And, this is getting the body involved again in consciousness, in spirituality, in imagination. As M.C. Richards says, all art is bodily. All art is bodily. I think this is one reason we have so little art in our schools these days, that it doesn't fit with parking someone in a desk for 7 hours a day. It's chaotic, it's messy, and it's bodily. You're not at home with that.
Just last week, I saw the most joyous event, which was just young people in Paris swing dancing to music from like 1928, and having so much fun, going crazy at it. And if that wouldn't be something to bring young and old people together, because it's old-time music, the band had tubas and washboards, and it was just, I'd never seen so much joy. It wasn't electric music, it was just like really old-time music.
That's great. Yes, I think our time is up now. One last question. Yes,
Matt, 25 years ago, I was suicidal, and I didn't want to be here anymore. And that was after 15 years of studying therapy and healing and meditation and going to India to be with gurus and doing all of that stuff. And the end result was it didn't work, and I wanted to kill myself. And that freaked me out because I thought, do I need to take myself to a padded room somewhere and get them to lock me up? And I sat down to think about it, and contemplating deeply, I started to think, because I've been introduced to the idea of the power of the future by Lazarus, who channeled me years before. And I started thinking about my life. I was in the middle of a painful divorce, and I was in sales, which I really didn't like, and I was losing half custody or half the time with my daughter because of the divorce. And I thought I was really screwed up in the head. Suicidal ideation is an indication of serious mental dysfunction in the classical terms. And then I sat down, and as I thought about it, freaked out for a couple of hours, I realized that what I'm really feeling is that my future is never going to change. And my career sucks and I don't like that. And love obviously doesn't work because my marriage is falling apart and I'm losing the connection with my daughter somewhat. And so I realized that the reason I want to kill myself is because my future sucks. And all of a sudden the light went on, and I said, the part of me that wants to kill myself is the sanest part of me. Because if someone offered you 70 years of a future that sucks, you should want to get off that road. And I realized I'm 100% sane. I just have these judgments, and I have this really dark future that I don't want to stay around for. And it's an option to be here, it's an option to leave. So in that moment, I said, I'm changing my future. It's either kill myself or change my future. I decided to change my future. I went and signed up for a hypnotherapy course because I studied every form of healing and meditation and all that stuff, and none of that obviously worked. So I went and signed up for a hypnosis course because that looked interesting. But then when I started working with those techniques, what I started to do is to take people into a brighter future. And I helped people like avoid suicide, as I did. I helped people heal every kind of illness there is, and change attitude and heal relationships. And so when I walked in today, I'm sorry I was late, I had an awesome session with a couple who just transformed their relationship because they saw a brighter future for themselves. When you started talking about original sin, that's one of the deepest wounds that I found in every client for the last 25 years that I've worked with. Not only the judgment that comes from original sin, but the poisoning of the future that happened with the idea of original sin. In two ways. One is you're going to be tested and tortured by this veiled, cruel God for the rest of your life and possibly forever. You may go to hell, so that future sucks. And I realized, until I walked in today and you mentioned original sin, it just like resonated. I realized that the damage was done 6,000 years ago, or whenever the original sin idea was sold. As you said, sold. I love that.
It was sold 400 AD by St. Augustine. 400 AD, 1600 years ago.
So relatively recent.
Relatively recent. It's not a Jewish concept. Jesus never heard of it.
Wow. Wow. So that it happened in the past, but it poisoned the future, as have so many things poisoned our future. And so that's what I found is the single biggest cause of stress, the single biggest cause of suicide is the hopelessness about the future, the reason people sabotage themselves, whether it's teenagers screwing up their lives or people eating, drinking, and damaging their lives.
One vision I have is that this order, and the idea of an order, could invigorate and infiltrate our educational systems and our professional worlds, so that people would not feel isolated or up against systems that are bigger than they are, that they would feel that they have allies and that the seeds of the future are being born. I remember when B. Griffiths, the last time I talked to B. before he died, he was probably late 80s, I think. And it was shortly after the Berlin Wall had come down. And he said to me, he said, Jim, don't worry about the Vatican, don't even think about them. Do what you're doing, planting new shoots, because it's all going to come tumbling down someday, just like the Berlin Wall. This was a Catholic monk in his full maturity. So I think the whole idea of planting seeds for the future is how I think about the future. I don't think it's just about sitting around in an armchair, but that's why I want to work with young people. And I want to see young people supported by older people. See this new intergenerational wisdom happening. Because this, I think, is how the future can happen. And it's not about turning our backs on the past. In fact, it's about bringing out what I call the treasures from the burning buildings of our various religions and professions. There is wisdom there, but we've got to bring it out. And we can't, there's not time left. It's like we don't need a new religion today. We don't need a new church. That's why I talk about an order, a movement that is flexible and that it develops self-organizing. And what happens, which is how a lot of nature happens.
But my question, if I can interrupt you here, sorry. My question was not so much about planting the seeds of the future. That's what I did for all those years with positive thinking, meditation, etc. But if you plant seeds for the future, but you actually do not believe that the future is going to work, the planting seeds, the meditating, the process.
Oh, no, obviously.
So I'm curious about, do you have
the seeds
that the future really can work?
Well, as I said earlier, defining David Orr's definition of hope, it's a verb with the sleeves rolled up. If the workers show up, and with that I mean the inner work, like you're talking about, meditation, right? But also the outer work. If people show up, there's no telling what we can convert to. And I don't underestimate our powers of creativity. So that's where, and then to me, seeds are forms, new forms by which to gather, by which to instruct one another, by which to pass on wisdom from the young as well as the old. I want to see that happen and see what happens. And I think the crises we're in, as you alluded to, there's a silver lining there. For example, even our withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, what's happened is over 3,300 cities and communities and counties in this country are taking upon themselves to not only follow that accord, but to do better. So it is empowering at the grassroots, which may be much more important than having it come out of Washington.
Yeah.
So I think that all this is hopeful, and that's where my hope lies. I try to talk about that today in these various movements and others we didn't have time to talk about. And certainly in the women's movement and the potential men's movement, that we can shake up our the frozenness around gender roles and mix up the authentic, healthy masculinity with the healthy feminine in both women and men and children, our children, and in our institutions. Again, I think that our institutions mirror the psyches of our people. And I think if there's too much reptilian brain consciousness in our world, you will find this embedded in education and in the professions and so forth. So we have to be melting that era of humanity that saw itself constantly under threat by nature, and so we always had to be the strong ones in the room, the crocodiles, to survive. But today, the story is totally shifted. Survival is not about being number one. Survival is about cooperation. And so that's where I see hope, lots of hope. But we've got to do the work. So thank you very much.